I'm willing to bet you haven't seen at least half of these movies, and every single one you've missed is better than anything that came out this year, including that new Wuthering Heights adaptation. Helena Bonham Carter was 19 years old when she made this. Her character Lucy goes on vacation to Florence, meets a guy named George, they have this moment together. Then she goes back to England and gets engaged to a different guy who's completely wrong for her. The whole movie is whether she's going to do what society expects or follow what she actually wants. Carter had to carry the emotional weight of that at 19, and her chemistry with Julian Sands, who played George, sold the whole thing. The movie's still considered a classic. Beautiful cinematography, great costumes, but mainly because Carter pulled it off that young. February 25, 1964. Cassius Clay just beat Sonny Liston and became heavyweight champion. That night he met up with Malcolm X, Jim Brown, and Sam Cooke in a Miami hotel room. That meeting happened. What they talked about, that's where the movie gets creative. The whole film is these four guys in a room arguing about what it means to be black in America in 1964 and what responsibility they have. Malcolm X is pushing them to be more activist. Sam Cooke's defending his pop music career, Jim Brown's trying to figure out his place, and Cassius Clay, who's about to become Muhammad Ali, is in the middle of it all. This was Regina King's directorial debut. She adapted it from a stage play, so it's basically all dialogue. The film got nominated for Best Adapted Screenplay at the Oscars. 1968. A group of women at a Ford plant in Dagenham were sewing car seat covers and getting paid less than men doing similar work, so they walked off the job. The strike forced Ford to recognize them as skilled workers instead of unskilled labor. It ended up leading to the UK's Equal Pay Act. Made in Dagenham tells that story. These women weren't activists or heroes at the start. They were just tired of being treated like they didn't matter. The movie manages to be funny and light while still being about discrimination and workers fighting back. You watch these ordinary people realize they can actually win, and that's the whole film. Christmas 1183. King Henry II brings his family together, including his wife Eleanor, who he's been keeping imprisoned. 3 sons, and Henry needs to pick which one gets the throne. Eleanor has her favorite. The sons are scheming. Nobody trusts anyone. Peter O'Toole played Henry and Katharine Hepburn played Eleanor. The movie's them verbally destroying each other for 2 hours while their sons try to outmaneuver everybody. Henry's falling apart and can't stop himself. Eleanor's been imprisoned for years but still has enough fight to take one more shot at freedom. Hepburn won her 3rd Best Actress Oscar for it. Early 1960s. NASA's trying to catch up to the Soviets in the space race. 3 black women, Katherine Johnson, Dorothy Vaughan, and Mary Jackson, are doing the math that's going to get astronauts into orbit. They're essential to the program, but they've got separate bathrooms, separate coffee pots, constantly having to prove they deserve to be there. Taraji P. Henson played Katherine. The movie recreates that 1960s period really well and tells the story of how these women dealt with being brilliant at their jobs while being treated like they didn't belong. It's about breaking down barriers without pretending it wasn't exhausting. In 2001, Baz Luhrmann decided to make a musical set in Paris at the turn of the 20th century. Ewan McGregor plays a poet who falls for Nicole Kidman's cabaret star. Pretty standard period piece setup, right? Except Luhrmann did something completely insane. Instead of writing period-appropriate songs or using classical music, he scored the entire movie with modern pop hits. You've got characters in 1900s Paris singing Madonna, Elton John, Nirvana. It shouldn't work. On paper, it's ridiculous. But it absolutely worked. The movie took the whole musical genre and flipped it on its head. Later on, you saw other period pieces steal this exact approach. The Great Gatsby, Bridgerton, all of them used modern music to make historical settings feel alive. McGregor and Kidman both committed completely to these roles, which was essential. Because if either of them had held back even a little, the whole thing would have collapsed into camp. Instead, it became this extravagant thing that somehow felt fresh and new despite being set over 100 years in the past. Humphrey Bogart spent his entire career playing tough guys in Simics, Casablanca, The Maltese Falcon, all these iconic roles, but he never won an Oscar for any of them. Then in 1951, he made The African Queen with Katharine Hepburn. He played a grubby boat mechanic named Charlie who gets roped into helping a missionary navigate a dangerous African river during the First World War. The two of them are stuck on a tiny boat together. They're bickering and eventually falling for each other while dodging Germans and wildlife. They actually shot this period piece in Africa. That seems obvious now, but in 1951, major Hollywood productions didn't do that. You shot everything on a studio lot with painted backdrops. Going to Africa to film was expensive, complicated, and dangerous. But director John Huston insisted on it, and the cinematography ended up being stunning because of it. Bogart finally won his Oscar for this role. Michael Mann read The Last of the Mohicans and thought it was a bad book. The original novel from 1826 was filled with racist assumptions about Native Americans and frontier life. It had been adapted to film before, but Mann wanted to do something different with it. His solution was to basically ignore large chunks of Cooper's book and go find historical diaries from that period instead, written by people who were actually there during the French and Indian War. Mann's team reworked the whole story using real history to replace Cooper's fictional prejudices. What ended up on screen was part historical epic, part 90s action blockbuster with Daniel Day-Lewis. The movie turned into this intense, detailed period piece that also worked as a pulpy adventure film. Mann took source material he thought was garbage and made something compelling out of it by doing actual research. The movie's way more enjoyable than the book ever was. In 1705, Queen Anne was sick, emotionally fragile, and surrounded by people trying to manipulate her. Olivia Colman played her in The Favorite and won an Oscar for it. The movie's about Anne's relationships with two women. Sarah, played by Rachel Weisz, who's been Anne's close friend and advisor for years, and Abigail, played by Emma Stone, who shows up as a servant and works her way into the Queen's favor. The three of them end up in a vicious power struggle where everyone's using sex, friendship, and politics as weapons. The performances were incredible because Colman, Weisz, and Stone all understood the assignment. They played these cutthroat characters without making them cartoonish. No wonder the movie did great at the Oscars and at the box office. My Fair Lady won 8 Academy Awards. That's tied for third most wins in Oscar history. The movie was based on a hugely successful stage musical, and the film version became an instant classic. Audrey Hepburn played a Cockney flower girl, and Rex Harrison played a professor who decides he can transform her into a proper high society lady. The stories about class and identity wrapped up in musical numbers, and what made it work was how seriously everyone took the production design. The sets recreating Edwardian London were so detailed and lavish that the film won the Oscar for Best Art Direction. Every musical number had this elegance to it because of how beautifully everything was designed and shot. My Fair Lady earned every one of those 8 Oscars through sheer craftsmanship. Everything about the production, the acting, the music, the sets, the direction, was done at the highest possible level. Gone with the Wind came out in 1939 and was immediately huge. Civil War setting, Scarlett O'Hara trying to survive while chasing after this guy Ashley who's engaged to her cousin. Vivien Leigh and Clark Gable both won Oscars, but Hattie McDaniel was the standout. She played Mammy and became the first black woman to win an Oscar, which was historic. The film broke records: 13 Oscar nominations, 8 wins. The scope was massive, nothing like what people had seen before. It showed the Civil War unfolding, time passing, history changing around these characters. The performances were strong and the production was enormous. But it also got criticized for how it portrayed slavery, which was a real problem. That criticism is still valid today. The film achieved something huge in 1939 in terms of scale and ambition, but it had blind spots that you can't ignore. Still, for better and worse, it's the film that showed what period pieces could be. Meryl Streep plays Karen Blixen, a woman living in Kenya from 1914 to 1931. The film is based on Blixen's own book about searching for love and independence in a completely foreign place. Over those years, she falls in love with Africa, the landscape, the people, the culture, and she's got this complicated thing with a guy named Dennis. The romance works because the cinematography was stunning. They captured the African landscape in this gorgeous way that made every scene between them feel bigger. The costume design was accurate to colonial Africa in that period, which helped, but really what you remembered was how beautiful it looked and sounded. It won 7 Oscars, including Best Picture and Best Director for Sidney Pollack. Karen's journey of figuring herself out was solid, but the visuals and music were what made it special. 8 Oscars, 4 Golden Globes, 4 BAFTAs, and yet somehow this movie is still underappreciated. The whole thing's about Mozart's rivalry with Italian composer Antonio Salieri. Except it's really about jealousy, Salieri watching Mozart's genius and being destroyed by it. F. Murray Abraham played Salieri and won Best Actor, and he's the reason the film works. They used Mozart's actual compositions for the soundtrack. Just his music woven into every scene, and it elevated everything. The set and costume design recreated 18th century Vienna perfectly, so you believed you were watching this unfold in Joseph II's court with all those societal pressures. Abraham's performance is what stays with you, though. Watching Salieri, realize he'll never be as good as Mozart watching that envy consume him. It's tense and uncomfortable and brilliant. Meryl Streep won her only Best Actress Oscar for this. Not Best Supporting Actress, she won that twice. Best Actress she only won once despite having been nominated numerous times, and it was for Sophie's Choice. She played a Polish Holocaust survivor living in Brooklyn, completely haunted by what happened to her. The film keeps jumping between the present and flashbacks to the camps, to her time with the Gestapo, to what happened to her daughter. And even though it's constantly shifting timelines, you never lose that heavy feeling. The present-day stuff feels just as dark as the war scenes. The film gets at something specific about trauma, how it doesn't stay in the past. Sophie's always looking over her shoulder, terrified, and as the flashbacks reveal more, you understand exactly why. Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton started an affair while making this movie. That affair turned into one of the messiest marriages in Hollywood history. And somehow, while all that drama was happening off camera, they were still making a great film about ancient Egypt. Taylor played Cleopatra, the last ruler of Egypt. The movie covered her relationships with Caesar and Mark Antony, getting into details about these unions that most people didn't know. And what's crazy is how they pulled off ancient Egypt in 1963. The sets, the costumes, the props, everything was accurate to the period. They won Oscars for art direction and costume design because the attention to detail was insane. But what made it work wasn't just the spectacle. Taylor brought this depth to Cleopatra where you could actually see her struggling. She's constantly torn between what she wants and what her people need. That conflict runs through the whole film, and it made this historical figure feel real instead of just being another costume drama. William Wyler makes a movie about a Jewish prince living during the Roman Empire, and he decides to go all in. 3.5 hours long, massive chariot race, pirate invasion. The whole thing mixing real historical events with fiction so seamlessly that you couldn't tell which parts actually happened. Charlton Heston played Ben-Hur, and the performance was so strong it won him the Oscar for Best Actor. But what's crazy is how much effort went into every single detail of this movie. Elizabeth Haffenden designed the costumes and won an Oscar for it, and when you see the Roman soldiers on screen, you understand why. Every piece of their armor was researched and planned out. Ben-Hur got 12 Oscar nominations that year. It won 11. The only category it lost was Best Adapted Screenplay, which went to Room at the top. Everything else, Best Picture, Best Director, all of it went to Ben-Hur. The chariot race alone was groundbreaking for 1959. They'd never filmed action like that before. The cinematography made it look bigger and more intense than anything people had seen. James Cameron took one of the most famous disasters in history and turned it into a love story between two people from completely different worlds. Jack and Rose, Leonardo DiCaprio and Kate Winslet falling for each other on a ship that everyone watching already knew was going to sink. The whole movie was about class divide and doomed love, basically Romeo and Juliet on a boat. But what really made Titanic stick around was the production work. Cameron built massive sets, recreated the ship in insane detail, shot both the 1912 disaster and the modern-day wreckage footage. The whole thing was designed to feel real. There had been other adaptations of Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice before 2005, but this was one of the few that got it right. Kira and Matthew's chemistry was so good that people are still talking about it. The story's pretty straightforward, enemies to lovers set in the late 18th century when societal expectations made everything unbearably tense. Elizabeth and Darcy couldn't stand each other at first, and then slowly that tension turned into something else. The build-up to their eventual kiss was agonizing in the best way. What made this version special was how it felt modern without losing the period accuracy. Scriptwriters kept as much of Elizabeth's original dialogue from Austen's book as they could, but they also improved things in places where the novel didn't quite translate to screen. This was Joe Wright's first movie as a director. He'd worked in television before, which gave the film a different pace that felt fresh. And somehow, even with all that talent and all that praise, Pride and Prejudice never won a single Oscar. It got nominated for 4. Best Actress for Knightley, plus 3 others, but came away empty-handed. Wright did win Most Promising Newcomer at the BAFTAs, though, which at least acknowledged he'd done something right. Greta Gerwig had directed movies before, but Little Women was where she really proved herself. She took Louisa May Alcott's novel about 4 sisters in 19th century Massachusetts and did something no other adaptation had done. She scrambled the timeline. Instead of telling Jo, Amy, Beth, and Meg's stories chronologically, Gerwig interwove everything. Past and present kept jumping back and forth, which sounds confusing but somehow worked perfectly. Gerwig really leaned into that theme of societal expectations, and there's this famous monologue Amy gives to Laurie that became one of the most talked about scenes in the movie. Turns out Gerwig wrote it after having a conversation with Meryl Streep. That's where the inspiration came from. The movie was set right after the Civil War, mixing real historical backdrop with the fictional lives of the March sisters. Everything about it felt timeless. And then Oscar night happened, and Greta Gerwig didn't win Best Adapted Screenplay. People were shocked. The movie had done everything right, and somehow it still got snubbed for what should have been an obvious win. Steven Spielberg made Schindler's List in black and white. The entire movie, no color except for one tiny moment with a girl in a red coat. The film told the story of Oskar Schindler, a German businessman who saved over 1,000 Jewish refugees from the Holocaust by employing them in his factories. Schindler was technically a Nazi Party member, but as the movie went on, you watched him go through this psychological battle with himself about what he was seeing and what he could do about it. Liam Neeson played Schindler, and the performance was heartbreaking. He went from greedy opportunist to heroic savior, and you believed every moment of that transformation. Neeson never won an Oscar for it, which still doesn't make sense. The movie won 7 Oscars, including Best Picture and Best Director for Spielberg.